Hello! It's another week of Read Aloud and sunshine, and of course, a breathing tool to get us started with our listening for today. So, as the expandable ball expands, you're going to make your belly really big with breath, and as I contract the ball, you can breathe out the air. The inhale should be through the nose. The exhale is your choice, through the nose or through the mouth. Without further ado, are you ready to get reading, Pippi? She's ready. Okay. We left off last week, midway through chapter 16, A Very Dirty Bird. And I have here with me my teacher's assistant. We are ready to get started, aren't we, Pippi Longstocking? All right. Now, King Azaz had just given Milo that magic pencil. Let's see where it leads him. Almost immediately, the light began to fade as the difficult path wandered aimlessly upward, inching forward almost as reluctantly as the trembling humbug. Talk as usual led the way, sniffing ahead for danger, and Milo, his bag of precious possessions slung over one shoulder, followed silently and resolutely behind. Perhaps someone should stay back to guard the way, said the unhappy bug, offering his services, but since his suggestion was met with silence, he followed glumly along. The higher they went, the darker it became, though it wasn't the darkness of night, but rather more like a mixture of lurking shadows and evil intentions, which oozed from the slimy, moss-covered cliffs and blotted out the light. A cruel wind shrieked through the rocks, and the air was thick and heavy, as if it had been used several times before. Wow, those last few sentences are what Tori would call show don't tell. So if you're needing ideas for your response, I think a picture would be very welcome. On they went, higher and higher, up the dizzying trail. On one side, the sheer stone walls and brutal peaks towering above them, and on the other, an endless, limitless, bottomless nothing. I can hardly see a thing, said Milo, taking hold of Talk's tail as a sticky mist engulfed the moon. Perhaps we should wait until morning. There'll be morning for you soon enough, came a reply from directly above, and this was followed by a hideous cackling laugh, very much like someone choking on a fishbone. Clinging to one of the greasy rocks and blending almost perfectly with it was a large, unkempt, and exceedingly soiled bird who looked more like a dirty floor mop than anything else. He had a sharp, dangerous beak, and the one eye he chose to open stared down maliciously. I don't think you understand, said Milo, timidly, as the watchdog growled a warning. We're looking for a place to spend the night. It's not yours to spend, the bird shrieked again and followed it with the same horrible laugh. That doesn't make any sense, you see, he started to explain. Dollars or cents, it's still not yours to spend, the bird replied haughtily. But I didn't mean, insisted Milo. Of course you're mean, interrupted the bird, closing the eye that had been open and opening the one that had been closed. Anyone who'd spend a night that doesn't belong to him is very mean. Well, I thought that he tried again desperately. That's a different story, interjected the bird a bit more amiably. If you want to buy, I'm sure I can arrange to sell. But with what you're doing, you'll probably end up in a cell anyways. That doesn't seem right, said Milo helplessly. For with the bird taking everything the wrong way, he hardly knew what he was saying. Agreed, said the bird with a sharp click of his beak. But neither is it left, although if I were you, I would have left a long time ago. Let me try once more, Milo said in an effort to explain. In other words. You mean you have other words? Cried the bird happily. Well, by all means use them. You're certainly not doing very well with the ones you have now. Must you always interrupt like that? Said Talk irritably, for even he was becoming impatient. Naturally, the bird cackled. It's my job. I take the words right out of your mouth. Haven't we met before? I'm the ever-present word snatcher, and I'm sure I know your friend the bug. And then he leaned all the way forward and gave a terrible, knowing smile. The humbug, who was too big to hide and too frightened to move, denied everything. Is everyone who lives in ignorance like you? Asked Milo. Much worse, he said longingly. But I don't live here. I'm from a place very far away called Context. Don't you think you should be getting back? Suggested the bug, holding one arm up in front of him. What a horrible thought, the bird shuddered. It's such an unpleasant place that I spend almost all my time out of it. Besides, what could be nicer than these grimy mountains? Almost anything, thought Milo as he pulled his collar up, and then he asked the bird, Are you a demon? I'm afraid not, he replied sadly, as several filthy tears rolled down his beak. I've tried, but the best I can manage is to be a nuisance. And before Milo could reply, he flapped his dingy wings and flew off in a cascade of dust and dirt and fuzz. Wait, shouted Milo, who thought of more questions he wanted to ask. 34 pounds, shrieked the bird as he disappeared into the fog. He was certainly no help, said Milo, after they'd been walking again for some time. That's why I drove him off, cried the humbug, fiercely brandishing his cane. Now let's find the demons. That might be sooner than you think, remarked Talk, looking back at the suddenly trembling bug, and the trail turned again and continued to climb. In a few minutes they'd reached the crest, only to find that beyond it lay another one even higher, and beyond that several more, whose tops were lost in the swirling darkness. For a short stretch the path became broad and flat, and just ahead, leaning comfortably against a dead tree, stood a very elegant-looking gentleman. He was beautifully dressed in a dark suit and a well-pressed shirt and tie. His shoes were polished, his nails were clean, his hat was well brushed, and a white handkerchief adorned his breast pocket. But his expression was somewhat blank. In fact, it was totally blank, for he had neither eyes, nose, nor mouth. Hello, little boy, he said amiably, shaking Milo by the hand. And how's that faithful dog? He inquired, giving Talk 3 or 4 strong and friendly pats. And who is this handsome creature? He asked, tipping his hat to the very pleased humbug. I'm so happy to see you all. What a pleasant surprise to meet someone so nice, they all thought, and especially here. I wonder if you could spare me a little of your time, he inquired politely, and help me with a few small jobs. Why, of course, said the humbug cheerfully. Gladly, said Talk. Yes, indeed, said Milo, who wondered for just a moment how it was possible for someone so agreeable to have a face with no features at all. Splendid, he said happily, for there are just 3 tasks. Firstly, I would like to move this pile from here to there, he explained, pointing to an enormous mound of fine sand. But I'm afraid all I have are these tiny tweezers, and he gave them to Milo, who immediately began transporting 1 grain at a time. Secondly, I would like to empty this well and fill the other, but I have no bucket, so you'll have to use this eyedropper. And he handed to Talk, who undertook at once to carry 1 drop at a time from well to well. And lastly, I must have a hole through this cliff, and here is a needle to dig it. The eager humbug quickly set to work, picking at the solid granite wall. When they had all been safely started, the very pleasant man returned to the tree and leaned against it once more, continued to stare vacantly down the trail, while Milo, Talk, and the humbug worked hour after 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 hour. Chapter 17. Unwelcoming Committee. The humbug whistled gaily at his work, for he was never as happy as when he had a job which required no thinking at all. After what seemed like days, he dug a hole scarcely large enough for his thumb. Talk shuffled steadily back and forth with the dropper in his teeth, but the full well was still almost as full as when he began, and Milo's new pile of sand was hardly a pile at all. How very strange, said Milo, without stopping for a moment. I've been working steadily all this time, and I don't feel the slightest bit tired or hungry. I could go right on the same way forever. Perhaps you will, the man agreed with a yawn. At least it sounded like a yawn. Well, I wish I knew how long it was going to take, Milo whispered, as the dog went by again. Why not use your magic staff and find out? Find out, replied Talk, as clearly as anyone could with an eyedropper in his mouth. Milo took the shiny pencil from his pocket and quickly calculated that, at the rate they were working, it would take each of them 837 years to finish. "Pardon me," he said, tugging at the man's sleeve and holding the sheet of figures up for him to see, "but it's going to take 837 years to do these jobs." "Is that so?" replied the man without even turning around. "Well, you'd better get on with it then." "But it hardly seems worthwhile," said Milo softly. "Worthwhile?" the man roared indignantly. "All I meant was that perhaps it isn't too important," Milo repeated, trying not to be impolite. "Of course it's not important," he snarled angrily. "I wouldn't have asked you to do it if I thought it was important." And now he turned to face them. He didn't seem quite so pleasant. "Then why bother?" asked Talk, whose alarm suddenly began to ring. "Because, my young friends," he muttered sourly, "what would be more important than doing unimportant things? If you stop to do enough of them, you'll never get to where you're going." He punctuated his last remark with a villainous laugh. "Then you must," gasped Milo. "Quite correct," he shrieked triumphantly. "I am the terrible Trivium, demon of petty tasks and worthless jobs, ogre of wasted effort, and monster of habit." The humbug dropped his needle and stared in disbelief, while Milo and Talk began to back away slowly. "Don't try to leave," he ordered with a menacing sweep of his arm, "for there's so very much to do and you still have over 800 years to go on the first job." "But why do only unimportant things?" asked Milo, who suddenly remembered how much time he'd spent each day doing them. "Think of all the trouble it saves," the man explained, and his face looked as if he'd be grinning an evil grin, if he could grin at all. "If you only do the easy and useless jobs, you'll never have to worry about the important ones, which are so difficult. You just won't have the time, for there's always something to do to keep you from what you really should be doing. And if it weren't for that dreadful magic staff, you'd never know how much time you were wasting." As he spoke, he tiptoed slowly toward them with his arms outstretched and continued to whisper in a soft, deceitful voice. "Now do come and stay with me. We'll have so much fun together. There are things to fill and things to empty, things to take away and things to bring back, things to pick up and things to put down. And besides all that we have pencils to sharpen, holes to dig, nails to straighten, and stamps to lick, and ever so much more. Why, if you stay here, you'll never have to think again. And with a little practice, you can become a monster of habit, too." They were all transfixed by the Trivium's soothing voice, but just as he was about to clutch them in his well-manicured fingers, a voice cried out, "Run, run!" Milo, who thought it was Talk, turned suddenly and dashed up the trail. "Run, run!" it shouted again, and this time Talk thought it was Milo, and he quickly followed him. "Run, run!" it urged once more, and now the humbug, not caring who said it, ran desperately after his two friends with the terrible Trivium close behind. This way, the voice called again. They turned in its direction and scrambled up the difficult, slippery rocks, sliding back at each step almost as far as they'd gone forward. With a great effort and many helping paws from Talk, they reached the top of the ridge at last, but only 2 steps ahead of the furious Trivium. Over here," advised the voice, and without a moment's hesitation, they started through a puddle of sticky ooze, which quickly became ankle-deep, then knee-deep, then hip-deep, until finally they were struggling along through what felt very much like a waist-deep pool of peanut butter. So that does it for the Phantom Tollbooth this week, and we'll pick up mid-chapter next week. Don't forget your seesaw responses as always.